Hello, I'm Soycaz, and the Italy of today is a wonderful country, but it's got nothing in terms of territory on the Roman Empire. This is what the Roman Empire looked like back over 1,000 years ago, when you could measure a year like 9 or 116, and this was the most loss of territory to most people's minds. But if you're actually going to answer that question honestly, you'd have to say that the country that lost the most territory is the country that had the most territory, the UK. Because as proud as you can be of the UK, you've got to admit that all of this territory is now lost, with even the Great Britain and Ireland bit being relegated to Great Britain and Northern Ireland, meaning that in terms of total territorial loss, the British Empire takes the biggest loss, with the second going to the Mongols. And I found this fun map showing the British, the Romans, and the Mongols, and you can see, interestingly enough, these three hugely historic empires actually had very little overlap, with the Mongols and the Romans overlapping in just Romania, Turkey, and the Caucasus, and with the British and Romans overlapping in England, which of course makes sense, as well as Egypt and this uncontroversial stretch of Middle East. And clearly this proves that because all three empires converge in Iraq, Iraq is begging to be conquered by an empire, which I guess also explains historic recent events. But with that said, I think if you're talking about empires and total loss, you obviously have to come to the conclusion that it's 1, 2, 3 for these three guys here. However, I think a much more interesting question is which country lost the most which wasn't an empire, because even when the British Empire was an empire, there was a difference between the UK and between the empire. So what about a country like Mexico, for example, which used to control all of this territory? I think it's famous that lots of Mexican territory was lost to Texas. That's why, Texas and Mexico have such a shared culture, even a shared food, you could say, in some ways, although I think Mexicans would argue they do some weird things with it. But you can see that obviously the United States took a lot of territory from Mexico. Part of the United States' huge growth was basically these wars right here. They took once and then again and then again. Sorry to my editor Naito for having to see this. But also, you can see that looking to the south, Mexico also lost a lot of territory here. This is the biggest example of a country which isn't an empire losing some land, except technically speaking, Mexico called itself an empire, and even though the modern day Mexico does not, without necessarily losing too much, I think that still means we have to disqualify it. The most territory lost by a single country which still exists and which has not at any point ever called itself an empire is Luxembourg. One of my favorite Wikipedia articles is about the partitions of Luxembourg, because usually partitions is something you picture with Stalin and maybe some other bad people from Europe at that time sitting in a room and drawing lines over some of the biggest countries like Poland. But did you know Luxembourg has been partitioned repeatedly too? Because a lot of people look at Europe and they say, why do we have a country this small just chilling over here? And that is a modern day view that is shared by the map planners of the day. So at multiple points, Luxembourg has lost some territory, and even though they've tried to completely annex Luxembourg, they have failed entirely. It is quite a defensible land, and honestly, it's just not worth the hassle, is the simplest way to put it. But it means that the Duchy of Luxembourg went from being 10,700 kilometers squared in terms of territory owned by them to just 2,586. In other words, 75% of Luxembourg was lost to Belgium, to France, and to Germany. This is especially tragic when you look at it on Google Maps and you see that, oh yeah, if you search for Luxembourg, the Luxembourg in Belgium, that's the name of one of their provinces, is bigger than the Luxembourg the country. Belgian Luxembourg, really gotta say, this is objectively the bigger Luxembourg, but also objectively the poorer Luxembourg. So who's laughing now? I mean, I guess the Luxembourgish people. There's an interesting point that the Wikipedia page goes on to mention about the idea that the reason this whole happened is because of the various partitions that went down. But they make a really interesting point about the fact that there have been lots of historical movements to reverse Luxembourg's loss of territory, but none of these have come to fruition. And the idea of revanchism is one that you might not have heard of before, but this is basically the biggest reason you can't just invade another country and take their territory. If you've ever wondered, because the moment you tell Americans, I'm sorry if anyone looked at this map, sorry to my editor Naito, a lot of Americans, when they see that, oh yeah, look at this thin strip of Mexico over here, a lot of them will just be like, why can't we just go there and take that, huh? And outside of the idea of being popular internationally and not committing any war crimes or getting into unnecessary wars, the bigger reason is that almost always nowadays, for the last while, if you are to invade a country, the people in that country aren't just going to say, oh, I guess you're our new rulers now, that's real exciting, who do we pay our new taxes to? I'm sure excited to join that interstate system or whatever else. No, the people are going to believe they're still part of the country they're in, which is why territorial gains and losses have been much more minor, at least in the recent last couple hundred years. You could argue nukes are also a part of it, but you could also make a decent argument that although Luxembourg has lost the most territory, that we're talking about, really here, we're talking about a decent amount of territory, but not really the most. If we start to talk a bit bigger and we start to talk by total lost land, because, obviously total lost land is something, but what if we say percentage loss? Because 75% of your territory is great, but what if I said there was a country that has lost more than 75% of its land? Would you believe me? Well, if you would, let me show you something fun, because here is Singapore. Singapore, technically speaking, so if you've ever been curious, like, I think everyone who looks at a map goes, why does Malaysia look like that? Malaysia is this lovely contiguous peninsula over here, and then it's this very not contiguous corner of an island that borders two other countries. It's very, very inconvenient, and the answer as to why is that this used to be Malaya. It used to be a British territory, and then when they went independent, the UK were trying to consolidate their various territories, and so they asked nicely if Sarawak, North Borneo, and Singapore would join the Federation, and they all did in 1963. But then Malaysia didn't really like Singapore, and so Singapore got its independence, not because they fought for it and desperately begged, but because Malaysia met without them and agreed to kick them out of the Union while they weren't there. That's a hilarious story that sounds fake. But long story short, Singapore got kicked out of the Union, and so you could argue that by percent lost, Singapore lost greater than 99% of its territory by being kicked out of its union. But again, Singapore would argue it was a part of a federation, so it's not quite fair. So the best example of this in the world has to be China. And I know what you're thinking, wait, China, that country? There's no way China's lost the greatest percent of its territory, or it would have shown up in the empires map from earlier, unless you're arguing that China has the real claim to the Mongol Empire, which, side note, you could make that argument just for fun here. You know how Luxembourg is, that there's a much bigger part of it that is outside of the country? You can also point at Mongolia and say that, yeah, the biggest part of Mongolia is actually in China. Here's Inner Mongolia, here's regular Mongolia, and just gotta say, fun fact there are a lot of Mongols and that sort of person who live in China. But also, very interestingly to me, is the fact that soon we're going to have this happening, but with Guyana. Google's already drawn the zigzagly lines. Venezuela is just looking for an excuse to take 2/3 of their territory, and then there'll be a Venezuelan Guyana, which is bigger and better than the regular one. But more interestingly than all of these cases is the fact of China, which, yeah, China does have some territorial disputes, but they're not for 99% of its territory, but I mean the other China. Because do you know, there's a claim over who's the legitimate government of China. If you just want to simplify the world, like Google Maps does, you can say that there's a China and that there's a Taiwan. However, neither country acknowledges that the other is the rightful ruler of its territory. And that makes sense when you think about China saying that they should own Taiwan. They want to own this piece of land here. They don't like, when China had a big revolutionary war, a civil war about who should be in charge, the communists or the KMT. Basically, these guys had a big fight for a very long time, and eventually the KMT, the original rulers of Taiwan, were pushed back to their island, but they always knew they were going to take back the rest of China. And although that ambition has been all but forgotten recently, it meant that the world agreed that Taiwan actually ruled all of China, and there were just some separatists currently in charge. In the same way that if I storm into the United Nations building and I somehow claim it as my sovereign territory, even if I keep that building on lockdown, it's over here somewhere, right? Even if I manage to keep the UN headquarters on lockdown, I don't get to say I rule the world or even that I rule this section of New York. It's that I'm temporarily occupying that space, and so that is what Taiwan claims China is doing. And so, fun fact, did you know Taiwan actually claims a large amount of all of this territory that China owns, but they go a step further and claim areas that China used to claim back when it was back before they had their split, which means they claim this part of Burma, this part of, they claim parts of Burma, Mongolia, Bhutan, India, PRC, Japan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Russia, and Tajikistan. All of these territories are claimed, but they also just claim all of Mongolia, basically. And so as a result of this, they technically speaking lost all of this territory. I mean, they literally lost the vast majority of it. And even if we just take a look at that, so Luxembourg went from being a country which was 2005, it went from being about 10,000 kilometers to 2,586. But if we look at Taiwan, they went from being a country that was, again, we're being very pessimistic here, they went from being a country that was 9.7 million kilometers squared, or 6.3% of the world landmass, to a country that is 36,000 kilometers squared, which therefore means they lost over 99.5% of their land area. And they went from being 6.3% of the world's landmass down to being... You scroll down enough and you see that Taiwan is officially 0.0% of the world's landmass. They went from being 1 in 18... one 18th of the world's landmass to being 0.18ths of the world landmass, which is, a pretty impressive stat to say the least. And so the country with the greatest territorial loss is Taiwan. And given how things are going right now, they might end up losing the entire thing, which is why I think it's interesting to say that this is a really fun question, which country lost the most territory, but the technical answer would always be a country which doesn't exist anymore. And so the easiest example of that would be Afghanistan. This is the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, which was neither democratic nor a true republic. They had one-party rule, and if you just look at the flag, you can understand the story. Ooh, doesn't this look suspiciously similar to some other communist flags? I'm sure that's a coincidence. But yeah, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan lasted until their leader was killed and the country was taken away after the Soviet Union fell apart. And look, long story short, this isn't a place anymore. Though the thing that overtook it is now also not a thing anymore because there's the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They've got a lovely flag, don't they? But the interesting thing here is the fact that you could make a decent argument that that is the country that lost the most territory. Or you could say that just in the, in the way that revanchism really makes this great point that really, even if a new government is in control of you, that doesn't mean you're part of a new country. You're just being ruled by a new entity. In the same way that if your landlord sells your house and a new landlord buys it, you still have the same house regardless of who's in control. And so the idea is that maybe you could argue Afghanistan is the same country as it was in the Democratic Republic or in the Taliban days. And so really you could argue that the Roman Empire is still sort of together. Maybe one of the things that resulted in the UK being able to go out and conquer the world is the fact that they had all of these things from the Romans. Maybe there was still some heavy Roman influence in them when they did these things. Maybe you could argue that the United States is a continuation of the British Empire, or indeed you could say China is just a continuation of the Mongol Empire, and that really these places are, the people who live in a place are the same regardless of who's in control. The only real advancements are when you move people forwards in the tech tree enough that they can actually do new incredible things. But that's a point I guess we could argue for another time. But now I just wanted to say the country that's lost the most territory is the UK, unless you mean proportionally, in which case probably Taiwan, and if you don't count that, then Luxembourg. And if you don't count that, then Mexico. And if you don't count that, then me, because I used to rule the world, and then they kicked me out of the UN headquarters. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you can support it over on Patreon. I'm sure you've noticed I've been spending more time here recently. If you want to support that and hopefully encourage more, you can go there and support the channel, and indeed, you'll be a part of some fun new ending card which we're working on now. But for now, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Second channel, don't care. Goodbye. Rule Britannia. Britannia rules the waves. But like 200 years ago. Not anymore.